Hello, hello, and welcome to This Week in the Middle East. I'm Francis Matthew, and my co-host is Eddie O'Sullivan. Hello, Eddie. This week, we have our guest, Ambassador Chas Freeman, who was for many years a senior American diplomat. He also was Assistant Secretary for Defense. He served in Saudi Arabia, and for our particular purposes today, he's a trenchant commentator on what's been happening in the Middle East with great clarity. Welcome to the program, Ambassador.
Glad to be back.
Perhaps I can start with what's happening in Gaza, where there's been a plan flying around for a ceasefire for almost a year, where Biden and Blinken got it together, but nothing happened. And then Trump arrives, not even before he was in office, and Steve Witkoff goes in and seems to knock heads. But this plan, so that's one aspect. The second aspect we might touch on is this plan is there in several phases. I mean, it looks though phase 2 and 3 look a bit shaky.
Well, I think President Biden and Secretary Blinken went through the motions of trying to arrange a hostage release, but they never used any leverage at all on Israel. And one has to conclude that this was largely for show rather than anything serious. Both of them are self-proclaimed Zionists and clearly sympathize entirely with Israel and not at all with the Palestinians. Mr. Trump did apply leverage in the form of a fellow New York real estate billionaire whose manners apparently are quite direct. And he appears to have read a bit of the Riot Act to Mr. Netanyahu. The result of all this, however, is, I'm sorry to say, fairly typical of the Israeli pattern of negotiation. And that is to grasp the expedient short-term benefits of a deal while deferring any serious discussion of the more fundamental or strategic issues for later, which never comes. There is always some alleged violation by the other side of the agreement, which justifies Israel breaking its word, or they just don't get to it. And in this case, we have very clear indications that that is the case. Mr. Netanyahu has declared that he has had firm assurances from President Biden and also from the new President Trump that he could resume the war of annihilation against the Palestinians at will. And therefore, I don't believe there will be a phase 2, still less a phase 3. And I would be pleasantly surprised if we got through the 42 days of phase 1 without something going wrong. At the same time, I should say, Mr. Netanyahu took advantage of Mr. Trump's support, and one suspects that Mr. Witkoff, who is an ardent Zionist, may have preferred this to Prime Minister Netanyahu as a sweetener. He has pivoted to a rampage in the West Bank with attacks on the Jenin refugee camp and military backing of settler pogroms against Palestinians, burning houses, burning cars, threatening people with death if they don't depart, and a very active ethnic cleansing campaign. So Mr. Netanyahu is not letting the dust lie on Gaza. He's doing more of the same in the West Bank.
Eddie?
Yes, thank you, Charles. Yes, very cute. Perhaps a little less positive than I am, because I suppose I feel that the images of carnage and the international response this has generated is something that everybody is pleased to see stopping. And therefore, once you've had a ceasefire, it's a bit like running long distance. Once you stop, you mean you continue to stop. People become used to lack of violence. Do you think there's a possibility that the ceasefire itself has got its own internal dynamic rather than external factors? You know, that people say, right, stop the killing at least, So let's just keep that period going and bumble along, even though there are breaches and complications around it. But ceasefire is a good word. It's politically a good word from practically everybody. So do you think that's possible, or you think that that Netanyahu, the Israeli government, and Trump will just shrug it all off? Some minor excuse, and off they go and they start bombing again.
I think the chances that the ceasefire, which is really just a pause of the genocide with an exchange of hostages taking place during that pause, the chance that it will last is very poor. We see Bezalel Smotrich, the finance minister, the self-proclaimed governor of the West Bank, declaring that he will leave the government cabinet if there is not a resumption of the genocide. He's quite explicit on this and does not use the word genocide, but he describes it in graphic detail. So Mr. Netanyahu's cabinet and his political survival depend on resuming the genocide. I think there's the one thing that might save this is the internal political mess in Israel. I mean, obviously, the Israelis are terribly divided. The hostage issue is one of the divisions, but there are others. Division with the ultra-Orthodox, the so-called Haredim, who fear being conscripted, although there's been a compromise worked out on that. The secular part of the population is dismayed by that and by the hostage issue. We don't know how many Israelis have emigrated, but it appears to be somewhere north of 600,000. This is not a society that is unstressed or that is inhabited by people who are confident in its future. So it's entirely possible that the hostage issue and related matters, I shouldn't have mentioned also the Israeli effort to undo judicial independence, which continues. These issues could, in fact, bring down the Netanyahu government, and that might alter things. On the other hand, what we've seen is that the vast majority of Israelis are quite bloodthirsty about Gaza and the Palestinians, and anyone who objects to the genocide is immediately labeled a Nazi, which is a rather odd, ironic label for someone opposing genocide. But we've come to that point.
But Netanyahu has so far resisted getting all the hostages back by insisting on continuing the war. Do you think there's an advantage to him to get the hostages back, or do you think the swaps will collapse before all the hostages are back?
I think there's a chance they will collapse. Mr. Netanyahu very clearly has applied the Hannibal directive to the hostages. That is an Israeli military directive which favors killing Israelis rather than allowing them to become the subject of bargaining over their status. We should remember that on October 7th, roughly half of those Israelis who died at the hands of Israelis, not Hamas. It was hellfire missiles fired from helicopters and incendiary munitions from tanks that killed a lot of people. So Mr. Netanyahu has never really shown any interest in releasing hostages, except through the use of force. And what we've just seen in the hostage release, this is the second significant hostage release, is that the use of force does not release hostages. It does not liberate them. The only thing that can do that is an agreement. This is the second such agreement. And I would note also two other things. If you watch the footage released by Hamas on the hostage turnover to the Red Cross, which if you haven't done, I recommend you do, what you see are two things. First, three very healthy young Israeli women who have been held hostage, but obviously treated pretty fairly, especially given the fact that their captors are probably starving. and denied medical care. Second, Hamas fighters out on the street
Yes.
in very large numbers. That's demonstrating what the Israeli Defense Force chief, the outgoing one, Halevi, has said, namely, you can't eliminate Hamas by the use of force. You can't, I should amend that. Hamas is used by Prime Minister Netanyahu and others of his political persuasion as a synonym for Palestinian resistance. So you cannot eliminate the resistance through military means. And so there is no answer to the long-term problem of Palestinian self-determination. And I know that Mr. Trump's new United Nations ambassador designate, Elise Stefanik, a congresswoman from New York, has denied that Palestinians have any right to self-determination. So there is no answer. There is no government alternative to Hamas in Gaza. They maintain order. No one else does. And I don't know where this is going, but it doesn't seem to be going anywhere good.
So if we leave Gaza in that rather sad position, taking a look at the wider priorities that the new Trump administration will have in the Middle East, where do you think his eyes are settling? What's his main priorities?
Well, it's too early to really say.
Yes.
He is mercurial, after all. But I think it's very clear that, much like the Biden administration, he is focused on aiding and abetting Israeli actions rather than on the alternatives. That is why I don't believe he would object if Netanyahu, true to form, finds an excuse to resume the killing in Gaza. But more broadly speaking, he does seem to have an aspiration for the Nobel Peace Prize, preposterous as that may seem. And he, after all, Obama won it for doing nothing.
Yes.
And so one doesn't know what those Scandinavians can come up with, but he does have an interest in that. He's also got an interest in real estate. He said Gaza is wonderful beachfront property and it should be developed properly. And I know that Mr. Witkoff, his envoy, is off to inspect Gaza. Whether he's inspecting it for humanitarian reasons or as a real estate deal, I don't know. There have been people in Israel who've been actively marketing beachfront villas in Gaza. So there's a lot of crass, inhumane activity going on. And I have no idea what Mr. Trump thinks about Syria. I know one thing which has not been really publicized, but is quite remarkable. And that is that the only country that stood up to the genocide with concrete actions was Yemen. And the Yemenis managed to conduct the first land-based sea blockade of Israel, the port of Eilat, which basically went out of business, attacking the allies of Israel, the United States, Great Britain, others, shipping going to and from Israel that was carrying cargoes for Israel. But they always said when the genocide halted, they would halt the attacks. And they've done so. So there's no more problem transiting the Red Sea, apparently.
Yeah.
Until the genocide resumes, at which point I suppose the Yemenis will get back to what they were doing. And so anyway, I think this is interesting. I mean, some people, prefer to overlook things like that, but I think you have to take account of it.
Now, Trump was the author of the Abraham Accords in his first term. And so there's a considerable discussion about whether he wishes to expand that to include Saudi Arabia.
Of course he does. Of course he does. And of course it's impossible. What we've seen is Mohammed bin Salman once again pulling a public relations trick. If you remember, President Trump in his first term went off to Riyadh, as I think is one of his very first
yes.
national travels. And the Saudis hired the appropriate public relations firms in New York and London and put on quite a show. They projected his handsome visage onto the facades of buildings, and they gave him a magnificent welcome. This time, in lieu of that, Mohammed bin Salman has promised $600 billion in investment over the course of the Trump second term in the United States. Well, he doesn't have $600 billion, and this is, I think, basically happy talk that will not amount to anything, but it has ingratiated Mr. Trump again, which was its objective. This occurred during a conversation between the two of them. So Mr. Trump has the characteristic of imagining that he is so charming that anyone he meets will become a close friend. And so if he meets someone, that person, whether it's Kim Jong-un or who it is, is instantly, I don't think Queen Elizabeth reacted that way, but anyway.
No, she had some experience. She held her ground.
I thought she did too. Anyway, he's got the best friend in the world is Xi Jinping, right? And he's very close to Vladimir Putin, and Mohammed bin Salman loves him, and everything will be fine. But I don't think the world works that way, actually. And I would note that the Saudis face a 99%, this is polling data, 99% opposition from their public to any normalization with Israel. Arabs have not reacted well, nor have Muslims generally, to genocide in Gaza.
Correct.
Or what is being done in the West Bank. And I should say here that, in fact, the US and the UK are pretty much totally isolated internationally on this. Some Europeans stand with Israel. We have Mr. Orban in Hungary, who said he would welcome Prime Minister Netanyahu and would not arrest him in accordance with the International Criminal Court warrant. But what is happening is that the NATO, the rump G7, the collective West, if you will, is now regarded with serious derision for double standards by the rest of the world. And the rest of the world is a pretty big place.
Yeah. Eddie, jump in.
Well, Marco Rubio is your Secretary of State now, and he is, as much as anybody has been, very ideologically committed to the pro-Israel project. So, and you have more, as AIPAC proudly boasted, more pro-Israel people in Congress, Senate, and House of Representatives than they've ever had before. And you've got a cabinet is pro-Israel, absolutely. So, but let's look forward in the first few months. I assume that Mr. Rubio will be getting on a plane and heading off to the Middle East region. Do you think at that point, the thing that strikes me is the possibility, because the Secretary General of the United Nations said that there's a real prospect this year that the West Bank will be annexed, that Israel will annex the West Bank. And that is the case. If Israel annexes the Middle East, first of all, is it it's entirely possible, is it not, that the Trump administration would recognize it as they did the Golan Heights? And then what on earth is Rubio going to be saying to the people he's hoping to work with? Isn't it obvious that the whole thing is going to run to a complete dead end, and it could possibly lead to an extent that diplomacy allows, a confrontation between Riyadh and Washington?
Well, Israel, through its actions, has destroyed its global moral authority, its status as a victim. It can't complain about anti-Semitism credibly in much of the world anymore, because it's seen as a perpetrator now of genocide, not a victim of it. It has taken the United States' reputation down with it. So I think Mr. Rubio is going to find that on this issue, at least, he has a major uphill battle to fight with pretty much the entire world. He is an ardent Zionist, or at least claims to be. He came from the Miami area in Florida, which is heavily Cuban, which he's born in the United States, but he's a descendant of people who, parents who actually moved to Miami before the Castro Revolution. And he's been very, as one would imagine with that sort of constituency, very pro-Zionist. So I don't know what he will have to say. I believe it is entirely the plan of the Israelis to annex the West Bank. I don't think the Trump administration will object. I think that will isolate us further. And I know that the Israeli Foreign Ministry has gone beyond that. It now carries the infamous map of Greater Israel, which shows Israel extending to the Nile and to the Euphrates, including all of Jordan, Lebanon, Syria, parts of Iraq, and parts of Saudi Arabia, which isn't a great boost for Saudi-Israeli normalization.
Yes, and so the question is, and it tends to be my view, that this year is going to be the ball falls into Saudi Arabian court. If this happens and Trump, say, annexation or even just the continuation of the resumption of the fighting, Rubio is going to go out. Do you think Saudi Arabia is prepared to stand up, look Rubio in the eye or Trump in the eye and say, we say no? We actually say no. We're not, it's a diplomatic no. I mean, but do you think Saudi Arabia has got the stomach for that because of the pressure it's going to be under and the expectations that seem to be exist in Washington that they are going to say yes to something like this nature? And on top of that, what would Saudi Arabia do in addition to just saying, look, we're not going to play football with you on this one? What else do you think they could do or are likely to do?
Well, the Saudis very seldom utter the word la, which means no, in Arabic on anything. They are very courteous people who don't wish to get in anyone's face, and but they have already done some things. They've organized a global coalition on behalf of a two-state solution.
Yes.
And they do have increasing influence internationally. They have diversified their ties away from essentially sole reliance on the United States, with the occasional participation by Great Britain and other Europeans, to put an emphasis on their ties with China, with Russia, with India, and to some extent Brazil. So I think they will object, but that will be passive aggression rather than direct action. That is to say, they'll stew, they'll mutter, they'll be uncooperative, but they are not going to directly get into this. And I expect that they will continue pragmatically behind the scenes to cooperate with Mossad and other Israeli intelligence agencies, with whom they have quite an effective clandestine relationship, or barely clandestine at this point. So I think this is, one cannot look for salvation of the Palestinians to fellow Arabs. They have demonstrated over the years that their leaders are cowardly on this issue. The public in Arab countries is very much the opposite. But there are very few Arab democracies. One thinks of Lebanon as a failed democracy. So where's the opposition going to come from? I suspect you may get more opposition from Indonesia, a rising great power in Southeast Asia, or Malaysia, than you will from the Arabs, because of this cultural tendency to avoid confrontation.
Charles, just one final point to this, because I think it's critical for the way we look ahead. So what we're anticipating, you've already said you think the ceasefire isn't going to last. It's probably not going to last. That there's a good possibility that Israel will, because of its confidence, say we are going to formally, permanently annex the West Bank, and that Rubio in the United States will say assent either explicitly or implicitly. But at the same time, that Saudi Arabians won't, and yet won't do anything. So the prospect is, I mean, looking at this scenario, is that it's kind of the worst case scenario for the Palestinians, you might argue. Any possibility of an independent state is gone. Nobody's going to stop it. There could be action taken by the Israelis to encourage people to leave. And the Arab states, all of them, including the rich ones, are just going to sit there averting their eyes. And it seems an impossible prognosis. It seems that can't possibly last because of the history of the region and the role Saudi Arabia has played. Is that what we're looking at, Charles?
I think the pressure on Israel is going to come from elsewhere. We've already seen that those members of the IDF who were stupid enough to film themselves on TikTok and other media committing vile crimes against humanity in Gaza are being subject to efforts to arrest them when they travel abroad. Many countries now have made Israeli tourists and business people feel unwelcome. There's been an immigration from Israel. Who wants people as citizens who have been guilty of genocide? Where are the Israelis going to go? The pressure is not going to stop. And I think there's also a constituency here that has not been heard from, but will be, and that is the great Palestinian diaspora. There are millions of Palestinians in other countries, not all refugees, settled. And I think the international reaction will be strong, and the US and the UK will feel the brunt of this, I believe, because in the UK now, I understand that pro-Palestinian demonstrations are being criminalized. So, I mean, the police are after Jeremy Corbyn and others for doing things that are regarded as hate speech, which I don't agree with at all. But anyway, I think we're not going to find an instant solution to this. It's been going on for more than 7 decades. It's not going to stop. But Israel itself is in jeopardy. Its economy is in tatters. Last time I looked, there were 64,000 small business bankruptcies in Israel. The economy is not receiving new investment. The famous startups for which Israel is justly famed have largely moved abroad. This is a very bad situation. So Israeli leaders cannot travel abroad without fear of arrest. This is not good. So the question then is, at what point do Israelis, other than the very enlightened ones that we all know, recognize that they've become an international pariah, that rather like the Christian kingdoms of 800 or 900 years ago, their survival depends on external support, and that's drying up. The scenario is very bad for Palestinians, of course, and I don't think anyone wants Palestinian immigrants either. And in fact, what we've seen generally, and largely as a result of Western policies in places like Syria, an avalanche of refugees have come out of the Middle East and West Asia, and this has become the central focus of European politics. Alternative für Deutschland is the direct result of the attacks on Syria and the efforts to do regime change there. So where are the Palestinians going to go? The Arabs don't want them. The Israelis may say, well, if you've seen one Arab, you've seen them all. But that is not the way Arabs think. And they have a common culture, but they have distinct nationalities and local cultural characteristics and patriotism. Even in Saudi Arabia, when I was ambassador there, the Saudis very proudly had no patriotism. They identified as Muslims. And now they have a national day and they have all the trappings of it. Mohammed bin Salman may not have given everyone bread, but he's given them circuses. So they tend to be rather happy. And of course, Saudis never really emigrate, or very seldom. Recently, we've seen some dissident Saudis take root in the UK in particular. But, family ties are so strong that it's a cohesive society. Palestinians don't emigrate either. I mean, good God, look what they've gone through. and they're still going back to where they used to live, which is now just a mountain of concrete dust. This is a sad story on all sides, I think.
Can I move on from that after that rather formidable ending a comment on Gaza, to look at Syria as our sort of final segment in our conversation? In Syria, Hayat Tahrir al-Sham came out of the north in Idlib, an offshoot of Al-Qaeda, but it came out and has now, after some years in Idlib, has apparently set up an interim government with a more inclusive agenda when it came to Damascus. So it's very hard to know whether Ahmed al-Shara and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham are the nationalist jihadi. You described it slightly sarcastically, I suspect, as he's now a democratic liberal jihadi.
Yes.
But so is he such, or is he conning the world, or because he seems to have started well?
He's an astute politician who has learned that if he wishes to get Syria rebuilt, he has to do a number of things, which he's trying to do. Externally, he's posing as a liberal democratic jihadi, and to some extent he appears to be getting away with that. Domestically, but his true nature comes out when you see the German foreign minister go, and he doesn't shake her hand, because he's got a lot of domestic problems. He's got a coalition which consists of really fierce Islamists. And when he says to them, leave the crosses on the churches, don't suppress the rejectionists, who are the Shia, the apostate Muslims in the eyes of the Sunni Salafi group, don't oppress them, leave the Alawites alone. A lot of his followers are very put off by that. So he's got to deliver benefits of some sort if he's going to hold this coalition together. I mean, Tahrir al-Sham is part of it. I mean, they are in the lead. But he's got other issues. The Turks support a unified Syria, mainly so they can go knock off the Kurds in northeastern Syria. They now have a border with Israel, in effect, Turkey does, which is rather ominous development. The Israelis continue to prefer the fragmentation of Syria to the extent they can't just take its land. Ahmed al-Shara is in the odd position of having to tolerate the dismemberment of his country. The same issues that arise with the Kurds, so-called Syrian Democratic Forces, arise with other groups. They say, well, we don't want to be integrated into the National Syrian Army except as coherent units. And his position is, no, you can join as individuals, but you can't come in as a coherent unit. That's very sensible politically, but it's quite difficult because these people have strong views. So what is going to happen? I did not mention, I should have mentioned the efforts of the Gulf Arabs, the Saudis in particular, who their foreign minister's just gone to, just received General Aoun, the new president of Lebanon, and he's going to Damascus. And, I think the Saudis are in there for two reasons. One, they need to shore up some opposition to Iran and Israel. Second, they don't want to see the Muslim Brotherhood, which repudiates the idea of monarchy in favor of the ballot box, the democratic Islamist movement, take hold in Syria, nor do they want to see Salafi extremists take hold in Syria. So they're making a big pitch to resume their traditional influence in both Lebanon and Syria. But just to wind this up, the collapse of the Assad government in Damascus and the flight of Bashar al-Assad to Moscow, of course, opened the Israeli path to an attack on Iran. And Israel has successfully achieved military hegemony in the Levant. Now, there's no question about that.
Yes.
It destroyed all of the ability of Syria to defend itself. Therefore, it has a clear path to an attack on Iran. And it also is now a major threat to its Arab neighbors in a way that it was not, as illustrated by that notorious memo. And so what we see, instead of the Trumpian effort to build a coalition between the Gulf Arabs and Israel against Iran, to make common cause against a common enemy, we're now seeing the development of a coalition between Iran and the Gulf Arabs focused on balancing Israel. And as if this were not enough, is Iran pretty clearly having lost its frontline defense, both Hamas and Hezbollah serving that purpose. Yemen, the Houthis, really, it's a different relationship. They now is under pressure to build a nuclear deterrent. And it has the ability to do that. Now, there's a very interesting article, which I call to your attention, in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists by a Chinese author who says, look at what how China built its bomb in 1964. It took 3 weeks to do that. And Iran has had decades in which it has not made a decision to build a bomb, but it has put in place all of the elements required to do so, and apparently to fit it on a ballistic missile. So we're at a moment in which we don't know whether Israel is going to attack Iran. We don't know whether Mr. Trump's envoy may or may not have advised Prime Minister Netanyahu that if he does that, he will be backed by the Trump administration, or whether he counseled him on the other direction. We don't know. And we have a situation where Iran is under pressure to finally do what it hasn't done, namely go nuclear. So this is a very tense and difficult situation. And to go back to Eddie's question, is Marco Rubio intelligent as he is? He clearly is intelligent, an intelligent man. Is he capable of dealing with this? Mr. Blinken was not. He was, in my view, the most pathetic excuse for a Secretary of State we've ever had. I've looked in vain for any accomplishment. He was essentially persona non grata in a large number of countries. And in Israel, he was welcomed because he was a wimp, and for no other reason. Is Mr. Rubio going to be different? I think so, but how?
I'm interested in what you're saying about the new coalition, but I'm surprised that the nuclear angle should be so important, because Pakistan and India are both nuclear powers, North Korea is, so many other countries have got nuclear weapons, but it hasn't affected their strategic, the clash or the fighting, or any, it doesn't made any, no one's used them or even the threat of them.
Well, I wouldn't say that. I mean, I've heard those threats from Israelis, and Iran is not dealing with India or Pakistan. It is dealing with Israel, which has a history of egregiously relying on preemptive attack to deal with perceived threats. By the way, preemptive attack was outlawed in the United Nations Charter, but it's back with a vengeance now in a world in which international law and the Charter have no bearing. We are back in a world in which might makes right. If you doubt that, look at what's been going on in West Asia. Or for that matter, in Ukraine. So I think I'm not as sanguine as you on this subject. But, I certainly hope that reason prevails. India and Pakistan have shown that nuclear powers can conduct wars without crossing the nuclear threshold. They have done that in the glaciers of the Himalayas and elsewhere. We have seen that superpowers or major powers can conduct proxy wars on a conventional level without crossing the nuclear threshold, although arguably we've stimulated Russia to develop a lot of weaponry that is equally lethal. the Oreshkin missile, for example. Anyway, this is not a great moment for optimism. And, you know, the sad thing, frankly, I think to maybe end this discussion is the United States could call the whole business off in Gaza and the West Bank immediately if we suspended arms sales. As Josh Paul, who resigned from the State Department admirably, he's a Jewish American. He would not sign off on unrestricted weapons transfers to Israel because of what Israel was doing and violating the United States law as well as international law. He has made the point that every bomb dropped in Israel by Israel on the Palestinians is an American bomb. It's coming from an American aircraft. The United States is completely complicit. So is your own country in this. You know, one has to wonder down the road, since the world is dividing between those in the G7 who are scofflaw, or, you know, the EU and Britain and US and arguably Australia, I'm not sure about New Zealand, and the rest of the world, which ironically was supposed to be the zone of barbarism, which Western civilization saved from barbarism, they are standing firm behind the UN Charter and international law. It was South Africa, not a Western country, that moved the issue in the international legal system. They've been joined by others since then, including your neighbor Ireland. Hats off to Ireland.
Ambassador, thank you. I think we have to stop there with that final thought that we hope that some sense prevails, but the outlook looks very dangerous.
It is grim, and I'm sorry to be grim. I'm generally a happy-go-lucky fellow.
No, but thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you
very
much.
Thank you very much, Ambassador.
Okay.
It was excellent. Thank you. Really appreciated it.
Okay, bye-bye.
So you'll have heard some comments there which give us all pause to think. We'd like to hear from you. Please comment. Please come back to us and tell us what you think. Some of those comments on Syria, that it's very unlikely to go right. The second thought I leave you with is the final thought that Ambassador Freeman left with us. All this could be stopped if America and the other allies of Israel stopped supplying the weapons. So please come back to us. We'd like to hear from you. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.